Yes, hello, and welcome. It's the third episode of the Secure Cloudcast. Every third Tuesday of every month, we get together. We talk about all things Kubernetes, cloud native, anything security related, including updates, especially in the open source world. So I'm Mike Foster, and I'm joined by my lovely co-host.
Howdy, Kim Carlos here, product marketer extraordinaire at Red Hat. So glad you guys could join us today.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks again. This is the third episode. Hopefully, you guys have been following along. We have a packed show. KubeCon's coming up next week, so we're looking forward to talking about that. And we have a special guest, Chris Porter, who's going to be talking about all things security, supply chain, ACS stack rocks. So if you have any security-related questions, drop them in the chat for him coming up. For those who don't know, like I said, I'm Mike Foster. I've been in Kubernetes and Kubernetes security for about 4 or 5 years now, with a background more in the DevOps and consulting, and joined StackRox over 2 years ago now, and recently got acquired by Red Hat. So it's been a fun journey. It's been kind of a hectic couple of years, but really excited. And Kim, why don't you give a little background on yourself as well?
Yeah, so I've been working in various areas of security since 2015, from threat intelligence to vulnerability management, infrastructure security, vendor risk, log monitoring, firewalls, all the different things. I like to diversify, what can I say? And I joined Red Hat here in January to focus on security use cases specifically for OpenShift.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. We got a packed schedule, so I want to get into the updates first, and then we're going to bring Chris on to talk more about all the security-related topics. Uh, Kim, kicking us off, you have some KubeCon announcements that you want to share. You want to?
I do. So, specifically around our OpenShift Commons, we actually will have a customer come. It's Pathik Patel, and he is actually the head of cloud security at Informatica. And he's going to talk about how, or discuss specifically around how they automate and operationalize DevSecOps to best address EKS security and compliance requirements using Red Hat solutions.
Oh, very cool. And that's at OpenShift Commons. That's on the Tuesday, correct?
Indeed, yes, it is
Very
Tuesday.
cool. Yes, Duran and I will also be speaking about that. We have some exciting announcements regarding ACS.
Very exciting.
I believe you have to get invited. It's for customers, and I'm pretty sure it's sold out, which is really, really nice to hear, especially after all of the previous events in the last year and all the hecticness that's been going
Yeah,
on.
very cool.
Um, I'll also be talking at Cloud Native Security Con bright and early on Monday morning, 9:20. We'll be talking about MPGuard and shifting left with those network policies. Pretty excited. I know Boaz is in the chat, so if you have any, let's say, Kubernetes and network policy questions, chuck them in there. As well, I think on Tuesday it's SigStore Con, I believe. Tuesday, SigStore Con. I want to give a shout out to Luke Hines. He'll be presenting and giving a keynote there as well. I think he's been working tirelessly over the last year and a half on that project, especially after the Red Hat donation to the CNCF. So I think it's really cool to just have all these people in one place, and really looking forward to finally meeting everybody for the first time.
Yeah, it's going to be great.
Any other sessions that you want to call out, Kim? I know KubeCon is packed and it's going to be recorded. Everything's going to be online,
Yeah,
typically 2 or 3 weeks after. But
I think those are the for sure like three main ones that I just wanted to call out today. Were, of course, Shift Commons, and then like you mentioned, SigStore, and then of course our Cloud Native Security Con where you'll be speaking.
yes, and if you missed the keynote, I'll be doing a little demo in the booth as well, the Red Hat booth at I believe 12:40 on Wednesday. So swing by and you get more of a hands-on look at what I'll be speaking about. And this is kind of a weird throw-in, but if you do like Cloud Native Security Con and something you want to go to in the future, the CNCF is splintering it off as part of its own specific event. So February 1st and 2nd next year, 2023, yeah, it's going to be its own event. So quick turnaround, 5 months later, and
Yeah,
it's a 2-day event. I think the CFPs are open. Kim, did you get a chance to look at that event?
I did not see if it was open or not.
Uh,
It is in Seattle.
it's Seattle in the winter, though. I don't know. It's going to be a little rainy, a little cold, but
No, not rainy.
eh, hopefully. I mean, you could always just make a quick trek up to the mountains in BC. Um, Yeah, the last thing, well, there's 2 more things. Istio reached incubation. I'm not sure if you saw this, Kim, but it was a huge announcement. Istio finally got accepted. It's still got a long ways to go to graduation, but for the project to be around for 4 or 5 years now, I think it's nice that
Wow.
they finally got accepted. Um, I'm sure there will be a whole host of announcements in KubeCon next week. And then, Kim, do you have any thoughts on our weekly reading? I added this last minute just to spring it on you, but
Uncool. It's uncool, man. No, I do not have thoughts. But we do have Chris coming on to talk a good bit about ACS, and we have had a couple of releases this past quarter, so we can sure talk about that. But we do want to talk today in terms of or some specific, listen to me, specific things that he'll cover will be around 6 overlooked very important Kubernetes features to secure. So that's cool. I don't know. I like
Mhm.
6 things, it's kind of just a nice
It's a
number.
very SEO friendly
Yes.
amount, let's say.
Yes.
What I thought was really
Yes.
interesting is it used our 2022 State of Kubernetes Security Report. So Aj
Yeah.
Mal has been working tirelessly behind the scenes
He's
to
so
talk
good.
to Kubernetes customers, get their feedback, talk about what's delaying production, what are some of the biggest security impacts in their Kubernetes clusters. And yeah, so it was really cool to have that reference. And I think, 6, sometimes 11, 12. You're supposed to avoid 5 or 10, I guess, for the
Yeah.
algorithm on Google. It caught my eye.
Always changing.
So, yeah, I stumbled upon it. I stumbled upon the link, so it did its job. But yeah, definitely worthwhile going through, and maybe Kim and I will expand on it, and we'll do like a 29 rules or something like that, something
Yes,
crazy.
indeed. I'm sure we can think of a lot.
All right. Any last comments before we bring in the guest of honor?
No. Guest of honor. Enter. Entree.
All right. Introducing Chris Porter, Director of Solutions Architecture at Red Hat. Welcome.
Thank you. Always good to be back and chatting with friends.
Yeah, it's speaking of KubeCon, you're not going, unfortunately, I don't think, right?
I'm not. No, nope. I
Mm.
will miss out on a trip to lovely Detroit this year. I've been to KubeCon on and off. You may have seen me there, and so no, we're coming from Stack Rocks where you and I just kind of did everything. We got roped into every task, every fire that was burning. There's less of that here at Red Hat, and I can concentrate on the other parts of my job because I do have
Mhm.
that.
I mean, you still have to toss your name in to go to Amsterdam for KubeCon Europe next year, I think,
Oh
right?
yeah, I'll be
It'll be
pushing
fun.
for yeah, anytime I can. Yep, I love it.
Well, welcome
So
back, Chris. For those
thanks.
who don't know you, I was hoping you could give a brief intro about yourself, what you're doing, from Stack Rocks all the way to Red Hat.
Great. Yeah. So my title here is the Director of Solution Architecture. So I have a team of specialist solution architects that help customers of Red Hat with all kinds of products and services here at Red Hat. You know me as mostly a specialist on the ACS topic and Stack Rocks topic, but I have other team members that are focusing on other areas like application services. I joined Red Hat like you last year from the acquisition of StackRox, and I had been there about 3 years before the acquisition. So, saw the evolution of the product during that time, and we're basically been working on that for about 4.5 years now. Prior to that, my career has mostly been a series of startups. Some of them through gone to acquisition. So I've ended up at larger companies from time to time. So the shifting back and forth. If you look through my LinkedIn, you'll see small company acquired by a bigger company, spend a little time there transitioning things, but always in security, at least for the last 18, 20 years. I've been working in security, things like email and web security, cloud security generally, and then of course Kubernetes and container security.
Awesome. Yeah, I kind of want to kick off this first question because you touched on a lot there. We've had Kirsten, who's been at Red Hat for, I think, like 6 or 7 years. We had Emmy, who's been working in supply chain security for a year and a half at Red Hat. Coming in from the outside, especially at tons of different startups and really joining the container security craze at its start, what are some of the greatest challenges when it comes to adopting security, the cloud native controls, maybe some of the expertise and organizational issues? Is there a common trend across all of your experience?
Yeah, I think that it's really not an issue about the tools and the technology. I think ACS excels at kind of presenting the new model in a way of that's familiar to most security teams. Most organizations actually struggle with the DevOps culture change, right? And so I'm fond of talking about that the first step towards DevSecOps is actually DevOps, right? Like you have to have this idea about the responsibility and the roles that everybody has in this. Everybody needs to be supportive of that, and that the tooling follows that culture, right? That ACS is really easy to adopt once you've already got the basics. I think the best thing you could do for security is to embrace that cloud native approach, right? When you think about everything as code, infrastructure and applications and dependencies, tasks like security and supply chain, which are related but not the same, I think end up being a lot easier once you've got that organization on board. When I talk to organizations that are considering that move, I want them to think about how security can actually help to promote those goals, right? I want this agility, the freedom, the flexibility. Security is often seen as the folks that close the door, right? They say no, they put blockers in place, can't adopt these new technology, it's not vetted. But I think with the right attitude, you can actually help support that organization. I'm a firm believer that moving to this model of application software development is actually better for security. That ultimately the automation, the pipelines is a way to get running these applications in a way that's more resilient to attack, easier to remediate. Like honestly, compared to running something on a virtual machine or in a cloud instance, where we work with the traditional method of waterfall and pushing releases, like this model is actually better for security. I think it's the ideal way to go.
Do you think that the everything as code helps? So being able to say, hey, here's a very hardened or secure pipeline. We have a new team that's getting onboarded and is going to start to use Kubernetes. Here, why don't we start with this pipeline as an example? Do you think that helps the security story, or is that?
No, it definitely helps the security story, right? I think that model that like you must declare all your dependencies, and you have to keep a very broad perspective on what a dependency is, right? The more we embed in that code, the more the developers can understand like that they need to make a conscious decision about these settings. You need that level of privilege, you have to declare it. You need that level of access on the network, you have to declare it. And that declarative nature is what allows us to get at that for security early on. When you're giving teams access to a platform like this, whether it's cloud, it could be serverless, or in this case we're talking about Kubernetes and containers, you're actually handing a lot of that decision making over to those developers. And we know love application development teams, but they don't always make the best security decisions, right? And that's because of the time is not there to deliver on both features they have to deliver and performance metrics they have to meet and security goals at the same time. So there's always a trade-off between the amount of time available, the resources, but you're handing a lot of power over to those teams, and that's something that security teams need to take very seriously. A lot of what they're bringing along, that they declare in those things, in those configurations, are risky to security. It's always easier to set myself up as the super admin, right, and give myself the highest level of privileges, because then everything just works. And of course, you can see that is what leads in a breach to become a major incident, right? The giving that kind of thing away. I think that in all of the methods and the production environments that you could run your applications in, like I mentioned, things like serverless, this is that one benefit that the limitations, the constraints of the running environment are expressed in that code that we can get at early on. The day that I begin prototyping my application, I can go and find out whether this is going to pass muster from security, right? I can find out whether it's going to meet my team's trusted secure supply chain sources, right? Is this coming from an untrusted source? Is it an unmaintained mess, or is it something that I can incorporate into my application? So.
Mm-hmm. And now, when a new vulnerability pops up, or you need to remediate it, something like a Log4Shell, it's a lot easier to implement it because you have these standards that are set up across teams. What does that look
absolutely.
like?
Yeah, so I mean, the fact that you have like known sources coming in, or you should, right? We'll talk about that with supply chain. Like you should know where your sources are coming from. You get that no blind spots, right? You know where everything is. And the automation that I referred to, right? When teams begin experimenting with containers, you certainly can manually build your container image, manually build your deployment, but teams quickly see the need for automation there. And the automation is what makes that remediation easier. When you're used to rebuilding those container images 5, 10, 20 times a day and re-rolling and redeploying them, right? You get used to that operational excellence of DevOps, of being able to make these quickly on the fly. You can quickly resolve a dependency vulnerability like that and push out those changes. Now, that's an ideal world and takes a lot of steps to get there. But organizations that have visibility in place and automation can quickly link those two things together to say, okay, now that we know about this is in the pipeline, let's start to remediate that in that pipeline and
Hmm.
get these teams aware. It's really about helping a development or any application owner, the ops teams or others, understand that they they have a responsibility for this. Like, they're part of the security story here themselves, and what they're bringing into the environment is creating this risk. And so we talk about that shared responsibility of security teams and DevOps teams, because like otherwise you get security putting rules in place that developers don't like. It breaks things. We're back to that old style of invoking security controls out of band from the platform.
Hmm. So I've run into a lot of, let's say, security users, network security types, where they just avoid Kubernetes in general because containers have a lot of vulnerabilities. It's a non-starter for a lot of different organizations. But I think what you touched on with the automation aspect is massive, because there's always going to be vulnerabilities. There's always going to be a new one popping up. And so when you go and deploy something like a StackRox or an ACS and you get 1,000 vulnerabilities, really it's that automation that allows you to, next month, okay, we're at 900. Next month, we're at 800. And we're focusing on the ones with high impact that are fixable, right?
That's right.
So when you're talking or educating a security team on, let's say, the newer way of managing vulnerabilities, what are some of the key points that you touch on with them, just in terms of getting started?
Well, yeah, letting them know about the process, right? The automation there, that it's more important to have a process where the vulnerabilities are identified and resolved than it is to fix any one vulnerability. Certainly nightmarish things like log4shell come up all the time, but I don't want to treat that as a special case. I want that to just be the day in, day out. Hey, there's a critical one out there. It impacts our applications. There's a patch available upstream from the various vendors. Now you have the automation in place that can do that. Or you can get to a point where it doesn't even require any manual intervention, right? The exposure of this in a common dependency really just requires going back and doing that rebuild, redeploy. Instead of thinking about, like in traditional world, like rebooting a virtual machine that hosts one of your application components can be pretty disruptive, right? You might have to have load balancers shift the load away from that particular component. In Kubernetes, that's kind of a matter of course, right? That restarts and things are really non-events, and you should embrace that.
Mhm.
We talk about that also, embracing the limitations of the perceived limitations of the platform. So security teams are often thinking about containers on Kubernetes as just another, mini virtual machine. But there's a couple things that we can demonstrate to show them that not only is that not really the case, right? And you definitely don't want to do things like patch and maintain them, but that there's the real advantage in doing so. That embracing the way containers work is ideal.
Mhm. And I think there are new, I would say, techniques to be able to mitigate different issues. Maybe you can't patch a vulnerability right away that day, but you could change the configuration or move a workload out of a namespace or something like that, right? Like, there's other Kubernetes controls that can mitigate a critical or important vulnerability, right? But
Absolutely,
those
and
aren't necessarily known, so it's challenging.
that's right. That's right. And this is my favorite topic. And it is honestly what StackRox was founded to point out, was that this is a different world, and that you can mitigate the possibility of an attack. You can put a stop to most classes of application attacks by making use of the features that are part of the platform, right? By embracing the nature of it. When you're running an application component in a container, that thing's not supposed to live an interesting life. It's got one job, right? It accepts connections from other pods, or maybe it's running some long running compute process or whatever, but it doesn't have the general need. It doesn't need to reach out to go and get, patch updates from Red Hat or from Microsoft. It doesn't need to contact, all these other services within your environment. It's got a very small world and a very boring world, and we can use that both to identify the non-boring, right, by as a signal that there's a potentially a threat here. But we can use the rules in Kubernetes to enforce boring, right? There's no reason for a container to write to the local root file system. It's not a virtual machine. You shouldn't be logging anything important there, because that's going to disappear on you. So
Mhm.
if you're depending on that thing, you're making a mistake already. But the technique of dumping a payload to disk and then executing it is a pretty common chain in attacks. So I get your application, I find a weakness that allows a remote code exploit. Boom, I'm using curl to download a crypto miner and then run it. That kind of naive botnet driven attack happens day in and day out. Well, for one, your container probably shouldn't be able to get out to GitHub. No reason for a production application to reach out to the internet in general. It's not a virtual machine. It doesn't have lots of different purposes. It has one thing it can do. So network policies with egress rules that severely restrict where it can get to can help to interrupt that. And then, of course, making all your file systems read-only, except for where you need to persist data. Again, we can look at that in a declarative way. I can tell you whether your file system is read-write because you've either left the default or you've actually said, I want a read-write file system. But we can check that and say, nope, this is a setting you need to change, right? And rather than do it for you, of course, we don't want to just change that on somebody because that breaks applications. If I make your file system read-only, boom, your containers are crashing. So what we do is push back and try to nudge teams to use features like that. But that's where that collected set of things can make your applications more resilient to attack just by turning on the options that are commonly available in the platform.
Yeah, I had a question about malware specifically and ACS and Kubernetes, and you kind of touched on it. I think best practice is just to avoid writing to nodes in general. That also limits that capability. I'm going to pass off to Kim because I've been asking you way too many questions. But before that, Dwayne Branch had a comment asking about, is zero trust a best practice or an evolving practice? I'm going to take my marketing hat off and give it to you, Chris. What do you think? How would you answer that?
Yeah, I think it's best practice at this point. That zero trust covers this basket of techniques that we can use here. Some of them I've already referred to, right? Like even though your Kubernetes applications are all running in the same cluster, there's no reason for them to trust each other. And you shouldn't allow, which is unfortunately the default, is allow this wide open communication within the cluster, right? That there's no reason to believe that another namespace or another pod is necessarily a legitimate functioning application in your environment, and being able to distrust that and just by default treat it as potentially hostile. It's an opt-in kind of model, right? That if security is all about looking for the bad from the good, right? And in a virtual machine, we've got antivirus engines and malware engines and authentication to look for things like, hey, this isn't authenticated, this is running something that we don't know. And then, of course, the attackers are trying to avoid those rules. Here, what we're doing is trying to reduce the noise, right? That we know what's good. And so if these 5 things are running, that's good. If the 6th thing is running, that's not good. If I'm talking to 3 other pods, then I shouldn't be allowed to talk to anything except those 3 other pods. And that's, not trusting anything else in the environment by saying, I know ahead of time what I'm trusting because I built it into my application logic, and this is the structure that I want to enforce. So,
and sorry, Kim, one last thing I want to put in before I hand it off to you. And in ACS, when those things do get flagged, or Stackworks, when those get flagged, you can create policy exceptions, right? Or violation exceptions. And that
that's
way
right.
you're putting the nodes down specifically that you're seeing it, you're aware of it, and you're understanding the risk. I think that
Yeah, we've always taken this attitude that to get to the ideal that we've been describing takes a while. It takes, evolving the organization's culture. It takes the tuning the controls. ACS would be, no good to anybody if you turned it on, you had to function in this way, perfect all the time. I like to point out that getting better at security over time is a good thing. You don't have to solve all the problems at once. I mean, you can't, right? There's constraints in time and money and expertise. So getting started means that you pick a use case, you pick a small environment, and those exceptions play into that. You can actually make exceptions and you can make inclusions, right? You can start with a small use case. Once that's successful, roll that out as a pattern across the organization. And of course, not everything's perfect. Some of your applications are going to act a little funky. They're going to throw up those signals that say, hey, there's a threat here. Well, it turns out, someone with domain expertise there is going to say, well, it's not really, right? It's something that we have to live with today. I think that security that, doesn't take exceptions into account just ends up getting turned off, right? It's noisy. It makes a mess, and then nobody uses it because you can't get around the rules in it. So try to avoid that with StackRox.
For sure.
Cool.
Kim, I've been hogging all the spotlight. So I know you had some comments about SigStore. I think you had a
Yeah.
couple things.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, but I also was thinking about when you were talking about exceptions and exception criteria. And I think that it was interesting because Emmy, when she was on with us last month, was specifically talking about kind of the risk-based approach in general for security and deciding what is an acceptable risk. So I think it's cool that when you're talking specifically within the solution, right, that you can actually, you have that capability and you can change it again as your security, or even in, I think, as you become more mature, if you think about it that way.
That's right.
So I was just tying those things together. So it sounds like that's right, which is good.
Absolutely, absolutely. So risk is one of those things, a little bit nebulous, but there's a lot of things that have to be managed through risk. And deciding what's acceptable versus unacceptable is very sensitive on the context, right? What I accept for, for my, less important applications versus my credit card payment or healthcare handling applications is going to be different, and it's going to change over time. And actually, risk might be dependent on circumstances that are outside of my control, right?
Right.
Situation on the internet, active exploits. Suddenly, that thing that I was less worried about before now becomes a much higher risk. And so, being able to, like be able to make that change over time and have a tool that can actually help you understand that risk and as it changes over time. What I love is too is with ACS is that customers can provide that input into that risk model, right?
Mm.
Unfortunately, very few do, but like they know things about their applications. They know which one is making the organization loads and loads of revenue, and over here, which one is subject to government regulatory compliance. And
Right.
that's risk information that you can express through Kubernetes standards in a declarative way, and then the risk reaction of a tool like ACS can reflect that. So cool stuff.
Well, so I think kind of going back into the idea of, hardening security, and we did touch on SigStore, and even, us having that day zero at KubeCon. I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about that. How are we as Red Hat? How have we kind of been involved in there as much as you can, much as you know, in terms of the project, and how are we pulling that for in terms of SigStore and the security there through to the solution with ACS?
Right. Good question. And yes, there's others that know, I think, more about Red Hat's involvement with SigStore. I mean, the goal of the project is pretty grand when you think about it, right? About improving the trust in open source software to avoid some of these nightmare scenarios where someone hijacks an npm package namespace, right? Someone ends up injecting into a broad range of projects out there from these dependencies. And of course, cryptographic verification always a good thing. I do think that in general, cryptographic verification, there's some misperceptions about what happens here. Like ACS is really just going to serve as an enforcement point. But the question is, what are you enforcing, right? As we mentioned earlier, I can have a valid, trusted source with cryptographically verified sources. So my open source project, like say a Java application, Java project like that, still can have security vulnerabilities in it, right? Can still use things like outdated cryptographic ciphers and shortened key lengths. In other words, the verification of the source isn't necessarily going to make us secure. So they're two things that go hand in hand. But when we're leveraging some of the capabilities that SigStore offers, ACS provides a quality gate, right? We've always acted in that way. The product has always examined the criteria of that declarative nature. One of those things could be the contents of the image and a signature. Do I trust the source of this? And so ACS acts as that enforcement point. And what I like about it is that it's pushback. It is stopping a developer from advancing something that is not meeting the requirements, but it's done in a very straightforward way. It's a fail fast kind of model, fail clean, right? I know what happened. I don't need fancy tools or to go to another dashboard to go look and see what happens sitting there right in front of me. Okay, it's not signed by a trusted authority. How do I get that signed? I have to go look into my process. I have to go enroll this and make sure it's passing through my verified supply chain process in order to get vetted in order to run it. But the goal is to make that something that I can figure out and resolve on my own before I spend too much time or have to call somebody or get on a Zoom or anything else. It just fix the problem and move on, right?
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that declarative pipeline is one of the advantages of SigStore, supply chain security in general. But y- what's like, it's not a catch-all for all security, right? I'm kind
That's
of hoping that you can poke some holes in maybe some people's perceptions of supply chain security in general.
That's right. So you're not going to catch me arguing against supply chain measures, right? We've seen the impact of things like the SolarWinds breach that was is clearly a supply chain problem. I think that getting well prepared against this type of thing. Right? We've seen the threats, we've seen the potential. So I'm not going to argue that this is a bad thing. I'm just going to caution folks not to consider that as a replacement for other security measures, right? Even if it's signed, there's two misperceptions that I see. That one, of course, is just the basic. Once I get through my vetting process and I cryptographically sign it and I verify that boom, that means secure, right? And we know that that's just not the case. Also, is the kind of perception that something that does pass all my checks remains that way forever, right? That
Mm.
once I've got that image signed and then I've got that deployment running, that things are good. But we know, of course, that that's also not true, right? 5 minutes after I build my perfectly vulnerability free container image, there's another discovery. Maybe there's a new exploit in the wild. Like I said, there's other configuration that gets dated, right? People still use things like RSA keys and they're quickly going out of fashion, or hash algorithms that are no longer considered secure. And so rooting all of that out is a continual problem. Time is not kind to security of your applications.
Yeah.
There's also that other perception that I think I see with this stuff. There's a focus on container contents, right? I know that
Mm.
software bill of materials is focused on this, but that's also this misperception that the security of your application is entirely dependent on the contents of the container image. And that's also not the case, right? I can take a same container image and run it in two different Kubernetes deployment configurations and have wildly different security results, right? I can expose one on the network. I can give it a service account for Kube that has cluster admin privileges. Like I'm just asking for trouble with that configuration. And that's again the point that we were making at StackRox was that security was so much more than just when it went into the container image, right?
Mhm.
So we're going to continue to play that role here of that little nagging reminder that there's always more you could be doing, and there's more diligence that you need to provide for your teams.
Yeah, one of the interesting, I guess, add-ons to supply chain security that I've seen are, you see things like Acorn or different types of dev tooling that package the configuration with the application.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, we talked about container image signing. What about developers if they create, like, let's say their network policy at the beginning, along with their deployment YAMLs and their services? Can they package all that up as part of an artifact? And do you think we can scan that in the cluster as well? Because then maybe you're not updating the configuration. The security team can say, hey, here's what we allow in this namespace. And then the only thing that's really changing is the container image with every deployment, right? Is that sort of where things are going in the next year or two? Not to pull out the 8 ball.
And ACS supports that kind of model where once something is vetted and it passes that check, like the change that you mentioned to the container image is something that, because of the way, again, I have to declare it, I'm either going to apply a diff, I'm going to apply that incremental change. That's something that would be visible to ACS. So you would know about it before it got deployed, and again, you would know why it didn't work if you just simply set that image attribute to change that container image source, left everything else the same. Unless the new container image meets the requirements set by the security team, ACS would reject that change.
Hmm.
So rather than fully tearing everything down and redeploying it, you'd see that model would work here as well. When it comes to things,
Interesting.
you mentioned network policies, and there is some work coming up on ACS. You talked about that a little bit. We're going to have some demos at KubeCon that I think really improve and kind of set a pattern for how customers can be successful with things like that, where network policies are one of those things. It takes domain knowledge about your application to understand, is this right, is it not right, does it allow the connectivity that I need, how do I troubleshoot that? So shifting that further left here, right, being able to check that ahead of time is going to make it easier. I think the right thing, of course, is that changes should be leveraging the source code control process that you have. right? If I open up a network policy because I need to talk to the pod, that's that's a source code change that should go through a pull request change review process. And
Mhm.
ultimately, that's how change management for security should be done in these environments. I want to turn the security operations people into source code, PR reviewers, right?
Yeah.
I want them to have that input to say, no, we're not giving you, open access to port 80 outbound. Like that's crazy, restrict this, right? So there's a human component to that too, but the tools that we're bringing in are really neat and being able to give you suggestions and to test those changes against the security requirements before you go and apply them or modify them.
Mhm.
So, we're trying to strike this balance between keeping everybody flexible, right? Like, hey, you want to use that? Like, I'd love it. You want to go out and experiment with that new memory cache technology? Like, by all means, but don't bring in this unmaintained, vulnerable mess and leave it wide open in my environment. So the security team gets to say, what's insane and what's sane, right? What's acceptable and what's not acceptable.
Mhm.
The key is early feedback, right? I want to know the instant I go out and find that project whether or not it's going to fly in my environment.
Yeah, and that MPGuard specific project, which I actually know a lot about. So, Chris, I'm
Yeah,
happy you touched on it. I'll be talking about it next week. One of the huge advantages is the developer can check it against created system policies, so that that all happens asynchronously without even communications between the teams. If I go and try to create or open port 80 with a network policy, it's going to automatically get shut down because ACS has a policy that says, hey, you can't use this policy or you can't use this network port. And so the developer just gets shut down right away. There's no back and forth. There's no, hey, I checked this into GitHub. Can you take a look at my deployment? And then security team comes in, shuts it down. Uh, to me, that's the biggest advantage. And I know that developers don't necessarily like working with network policies too. So to have that
yep.
automated in a way that they could check it in or test it before they go and reach out, I think is a great addition.
Yeah, absolutely. And the key is like, again, I know I say this all the time when I talk to customers. We know that developers don't like security products. They don't want to have to deal with that. But in the old days, if you ever sat at a workstation or you're working on an application server and there's a firewall somewhere, some network device that's interfering with your communication, it's so frustrating to find out where that is, why that's in place, who owns that, how to get it changed, right? It's a black hole. Your packets disappear. So in this case, as a developer, if I have to deal with this stuff, I want it in network policies that are in YAML that I can read. And I want it running, when I'm running on Minishift on in a test environment, right? I want this front and center part of my application so that as I go through my automated testing and I hit a roadblock, I know why it is there and what the problem is and get it fixed. It's all about solving those problems earlier. Now,
Mhm.
the security team gets what they want because they're able to set those guardrails, but within that, the developers are free to operate. And this is about reducing that friction.
Yeah.
Okay, you got this big sandbox to play in, but keep the sand in the sandbox, please.
Mhm. And I think there's one more model there too, which is operations teams can use this automated function to go into the different repositories, let's say, and pull out deployment information, and
Yep,
then create PRs against developers' existing applications, right?
yep,
So I can go in and automatically generate a network policy for you. The developer doesn't even have to touch it, and then um, we can move forward, and I can make sure that, hey, okay, all of my different organizations are properly segmented in Kubernetes. They have correct network policies according to ACS and the policy generator we've set up. Um, it doesn't necessarily need to be another CLI that the developer uses. It can also be something that the different teams can use to
that's right.
check in with the developer. So I think it's that flexibility in an automated fashion, and not through a UI. Something that's can be deployed in a pipeline that can break a pipeline as well, right?
Yep.
It's
That's what I'm really excited about because we've had these type of features, these suggestion features in ACS for a long time. It was one of the first really cool, innovative Kubernetes native things that we did. But it has had that challenge of operational. How do I use this feature, right? Do I have to wait until something's running to see traffic before I can build rules around that traffic? And this upcoming capability is going to help to make that a lot easier. So yeah, I'm very excited to see it. I've been playing around with it myself. It's magic, right? It kind of just works. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and if anybody's in the Slack channel, the Stack Rocks channel in the CNCF workspace, we do have a lot of PMs. Chris is there, some existing essays, and uh, um, Stack Rocks employees are in that chat as well. So if you have any questions or feedback, we'd love to hear it from you. especially when it comes to network policies and doing that in an organization. That's always a very cool use case. I think we have time for a few more questions. Kim, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Cool. Yeah. So I hear, Chris, that you may have a hot take on more about the idea of supply chain security efforts and kind of what that means. I know you were like, I think I'll talk a little bit more about that. I've heard it described on one of our last episodes as sort of the idea of the trusted supply chain. We had Amy Addy come on and discuss it a little bit further, and I'd love to know your hot take on that. Tell me what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I get asked about this a lot. We talk about it, and I think the problem is actually that word "secure" being in that secure supply chain, right? That it implies something that's not really there. Don't put, too much into that wording. But I think we've talked about this. I think the trusted supply chain is certainly a thing there. So totally, I believe that's necessary, but I don't want people to think that suddenly the days of security oversight are done once we have this problem solved, right? The landscape changes too quickly. There's still, of course, regulatory and industry compliance standards that, sure, they might adopt new recommendations now, especially from the U.S. federal government around trusted supply chain. But for most organizations, I'm not even sure that's still the biggest risk, right? We see that most of the active threats against applications out there are exactly what you'd expect. Automated systems probing for known software and known weaknesses. All you do is run a little honeypot network for a while, and you'll watch these folks come into your front door. It's all automated. It's all botnets on broadband networks out there, just probing and looking for these things. So sure. So solve the supply chain problem. I think the first part of that is understanding it, which ACS can help you with. Where's this stuff coming from? Where are my developers getting their things from? When are they updating it? Are they keeping it updated and following good practices? But it doesn't solve ultimately the security problem. You're still going to have those same tasks. So lots of buzz, but it's not magic.
Mm-hmm.
I think that some of the technologies in here are really interesting, like software bill of materials. I'm still wondering, what are we going to do with this? What do we, is it just to provide somebody with a spreadsheet, and who's going to look at that, right? If I have a bill of materials for my applications, like a lot of things in technology and especially in security and in compliance, I think it's going to come down to knowing who to blame, right? When an incident does occur, come on, let's have the
spot on.
security.
It's so true. Yeah.
Right? Where did this threat come from? Oh, it was this unpatched vulnerability. Who owned that application when didn't patch it? There they are. Let's find the person that we can blame for this. I mean, all joking aside, like understanding who owns a particular component is an important thing. Like, who's responsible for that? Make that clear. I think even developers that build apps and build their own containers don't realize that they are responsible. There's an implication there that's not really, it's never explicit to them that, hey, you bring in that log4j library, you are responsible for maintaining it. That's the curse of containers, right? There's a blessing, but there's also this curse that you're left then with owning all the pieces of your application, whether you know about them or not. So
yeah, I think that's one of the challenges with SBOMs in general is, one, changes depending on the language that you're using. There's also who is maintaining and updating this, right? Is it developers? Maybe it's an open source project where there's 2 developers on it, so it's not completely accurate or up to date. So there has to be some sort of verification of who's actually managing this and updating the bill of materials. It becomes, again, a whole pointing finger game. And so just because there's a manifest saying the listed ingredients are X, that doesn't necessarily mean it's accurate or up to a specific standard. And so you're seeing a lot of companies come out and say, we'll verify these 500 packages or these 500 sources, right? And again, I think it's just going to be continuously a challenge over the next, maybe, I don't know, I'd say for a while now. But it's in its infancy, right?
Yeah, well, one of my favorite tricks, if you're an app developer, you're a DevOps, you're involved in the creation of the maintenance of these applications, you can save yourself a lot of trouble, right? With vulnerabilities, with things like SBOM and supply chain problems that are going to come onto your desk, whether you want them to or not, by eliminating as much of that stuff as possible, right? Red Hat produces a set of minimal base images that you can build on top of. You just don't need all that stuff. And if you're not using it, well, the security perspective is, why would you give an attacker access to that if you don't use it? You don't need it. But for my day-to-day work, why do you want to maintain and patch that, right? The best way to handle vulnerabilities in a given component that's in your container image is not to have it there at all. Why would you want to maintain and deal with that, right? Build smaller images. And ACS tries to carve this out by showing you here's some really dangerous stuff. It's what we call components that are useful for an attacker, right? And then there's stuff in there that teams don't like to get rid of, like curl and stuff. But even a shell like bash, like what do you need a user interactive shell for, right? If that binary is not present in your container, nobody can ever use it against you. And it doesn't go up in the SBOM, and it's not going to fall on your desk to maintain that and fix the vulnerabilities in it. So
and we have init containers in Kubernetes for things like that, specific containers that are
right.
designed, and then they disappear so that curl isn't sitting right next to your running process.
That's
or
right.
In your process.
Use
right?
ephemeral containers. Right. Yep. There's a ton of
And so,
techniques for troubleshooting things. Yep.
yeah.
Sorry,
and I think, I think that's spot on. It's just, here's the way that you're running it. You kind of bundle it all in one. And then as organizations grow and they realize they have these Kubernetes native controls, again, a lot of your applications become less and less vulnerable over time. And so it's just pointing that out, saying, hey, there's an alternative. But if you're used to working in virtual machines where you put everything in there, it's just a slightly different workload. Any last questions, Kim? I think we're coming up on the hour. Just want to make sure that we wrap it up.
I mean, I'm sure I could stay here all day, and we'll bring you back. But considering time, I think we're probably at a good place. Is there anything that you wanted to add, Chris?
There's some cool stuff coming. I'm looking forward to the announcements that are going to come out at KubeCon. We'd love everyone to participate in this stuff. The network policy, the shift left thing that we talked about is available to developer preview if you want to kick the tires on that. Do reach out to us on Slack. And looking forward to collaborating. Some great stuff being planned for next year. So stay tuned.
Yeah, definitely. And again, all those are going to be recorded and online. So I'm hoping to post them in the StackRox channel in the CNCF if you're interested. Otherwise, until next month, the third Tuesday of every month at 2 p.m., we'll be here, the Secured Cloudcast. I'm Mike Foster, and Kim, I'll give you the final word on the sign-off.
All right. I'm Kim Carlos. Hasta la pasta, and we will see you next month.
See you next month.